All right, hello everybody. So welcome. We're about to start the second session of this fantastic day here entitled Practice in an Expanded Field. My name is Graeme Stewart. I'm a fairly recent alum. I started here when Larry Richards was dean in 2000 and graduated in 2007 under George Baird. And so it's a great pleasure and great honor to be here to moderate this session today. And we were just discussing, I mean, it's really amazing in an event like this that makes you realize the importance of a professional school and the importance of this particular school to this country and the practice. And the exhibition and its sort of reference to the Soane Museum and the amazing collection of things, I think there's a book waiting to happen. So congratulations to everyone for organizing all this. So we have a bit of a diverse group with this session, and the unifying thread is looking at how the opportunities of practice and research and practice have expanded dramatically over the years. And we're looking at three very interesting individuals who are doing incredible things, both in terms of pure research, expanded research, and different forms of practice. And some of the themes that brings us together in our kind of fruitful conversations ahead of this is sort of the role of culture, the role of advocacy, the role of research, and really the role of a design education in preparing people for an expanded sort of field of practice over decades, and how do things change over long periods, and how does emergent opportunities, expand what could be sort of the box of a traditional, you design a building, you get it built, you watch it get built, and you're done. There's actually a lot more opportunities going on. So without further ado, I will introduce the three speakers who will be joining me up here. So the first is Michael McClelland. And so among other things, as a founding partner at Eha Architects, Michael McClelland is my boss. So I will try to do this in the most illustrious way possible. Michael is a founding partner of ERA Architects. And so ERA specializes in heritage conservation, cultural planning, planning and urban design, among many, many other things. And so Michael's role over the years, among many other adventures, is being a specialty heritage advisor to the Art Gallery of Ontario, the ROM, Ryerson University, U of T, the Distillery District, and, any number of projects in the city. I think we actually have 368 active projects in the practice right now, so we're quite busy. And I think this is deviating from the script a little bit. I think what I find really remarkable about working with Michael and being part of the practice is this real commitment to values and this real commitment to sort of working with a range of how is it stated here, a range of public and private stakeholders to build culture through thoughtful, value-based planning and design. And that requires a lot of sort of specialty thinking and negotiation. Michael is well known for his contribution to the discourse surrounding stewardship to the built environment, and one of the things that we do and will be talked about here is expanding that conversation through exhibitions, through publications such as Concrete Toronto, or a book that was just released that Michael edited called The Ward, The Life and Loss of Toronto's First Immigrant Neighborhood. Next we have Eha Naylor. Actually, I should have mentioned that Michael is an alum of 1981. I was rather young then. Eha is just a year before, in 1980. Eha is a partner at Dialon Consulting, and she leads their urban design and master planning work, and has been doing so for over 30 years. He is a full member of several professional organizations, including the OLA, the American Association of Landscape Architects, and is a fellow of this Canadian Society of Landscape of Architects. In 2014, she received the OLA Pinnacle Award for Landscape Architecture Excellence. Eha has served in several design juries and has also appeared as an environmental planning expert witness for the OMB and other sort of major decision-making bodies. She's currently appointed to the Federal National Capital Commission and serves as the Landscape Architecture Canada Foundation Board. So fairly illustrious. Lots of part of the discussions we had is just the influence and working with stakeholders to make big decisions made. So clearly you're in a position to do that. And next we have Liat Margolis. So Liat is a practitioner and a faculty member here. So not an alum of the school, but is creating the next generation of alum. Liat is an assistant professor and is the director of the Green Roof Innovation Testing Lab, or GRIT Lab, which is a pretty fantastic thing that we'll hear more about. So a multidisciplinary research and education hub linking the fields of landscape architecture, biology, hydrology, and building science, and manages a team of researchers and industry partners. And what's so interesting about this is the role of traditional research with the built environment, and as a designer, how do you manage and how do you work with more traditional fields of research that are a little bit more uni-focused. And so before coming here, before coming to Daniel, she directed the material collection at the GSD, which sounds really fantastic, and was the director of research at Material Connections, where she developed material database and consulted with a broad range of firms and consultants. So we have an amazing crew here. We're each going to give 5-minute presentations. We have been kept to that. My main role as a moderator is just to make sure that I'm a timekeeper. So we'll be strict to our 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up to a large discussion. So without further ado, here is Michael McClelland. Cheers.
When I graduated in 81, the school had gone through a period of crisis, and there seemed to be, people described it as a period of crisis. You could go to one class and you'd hear one thing, you go to another class and you hear a totally different thing, and the professional opinions were very disparate. So Alberto Perez Gomez, Peter Bragnall, George Baird, and occasionally you have people like Joseph Wickwert, Rem Koolhaus, Daniel Liebskin. Everyone would appear, and you'd hear many different things. And I didn't find it a crisis point. I found it a hugely invigorating position. And I found the diversity that I got in the school to help me immensely in my career, because that's what you face in the outside world. What I did find, however, that leaving the school, I found all that became very depressing. Architecture, as ruled by the OAA, was a whole different thing. And I felt it was a bit like I'm a big fan of General Idea. They felt at the time that art in Toronto lacked relevance. They found that what artists were doing lacked relevance. And so they decided that they would create their whole career on what an artist should do. So they created vernissage and critical events and parties and all sorts of things. And so I thought, inspiration for me, I thought, well, I should be thinking, what does an architect do? Not think what an architect can do in Toronto, but what an architect should do. And so I've found, and I think I got this from the school, that there was an incredible potential to do interesting and new things. Oops, I turned it off? What did I do? I'm sorry, I don't know what I did here. Oh, there we go, okay. The direction I decided to go was into heritage, and because I wanted to look at heritage for several reasons. One is I was really influenced by Eric Arthur, who actually, also a modernist, was also one of the key historians for the province of Ontario. But I also found I was interested in value and interested in understanding how do we achieve and how do we understand value. And I found that talking about heritage buildings that people loved and adored, was a kind of mother lode for that kind of discussion. I've been influenced by George Baird into writers like Richard Sennett and Hannah Arendt, and I've continued, I regard my education not finishing when I left school. I think as an architecture, education continues forever. I became interested in Pierre Bourdieu's discussion about taste and valuation, class. I became very interested in Richard Rorty as a pragmatist philosopher, to understand the ideas about how you direct your opinions and what you do with them. And then as I've thought through architecture more and more, I've realized that everything that architects do go vastly beyond the practice of architecture, because everything we do actually has a larger effect on our community. And the test case has been mentioned a couple of times. Graeme was a student at the School of Architecture, working as a student at summers in our office, came up with a thesis which was really fun. We decided, let's make that political. Now the City of Toronto has completely rezoned all those apartment neighborhoods at our push to do that. So advocacy, and it was a reversal to look at the suburbs to say they have value. What's the history of planning in the suburbs? How does that work? Really test people's understanding of value, architecture, and what Pierre Bourdieu would call cultural production. And so this is a little test case. This is of we don't just do books, but this is just like a little example. So we take the ideas of Bourdieu's ideas about taste, we take the ideas of Rorty's ideas about pragmatism, and we apply them to, here's 3 books over different decades. The first one is called East-West. Basically, I phoned up 50 or 60 people and said, just write a little bit about living in the city of Toronto. We just dissected the city in 2 locations and said, write something about those places. The next book, Concrete Toronto, the architecture that no one was friends with, and I kept getting fed up by people saying, you're an architect, you must hate Robarts Library. Didn't hate Robarts Library. So 60 people writing pre-canonic positions about concrete architecture. And then The Ward, which just came out, another venture editor on all 3, but talking about 60 people and their opinions about the ward. So the idea is to try and actually shift people's sense of history, architecture, and the city. And this is my last slide, and I've only got 13 seconds. So this is the Distillery District. This is about collaboration. We found that our work is collaborative and an issue of stewardship. So I've worked on this site for 20 years now with a classmate of mine, Jamie Goad, who's in the audience. So it just continues. I've had the honor to work in collaboration with many of the people in the room. So I work, KPMB Architects, Shim Sutcliffe Architects, CMAC and David. So the collaboration continues. The collaboration's in our office. It's outside of our office. We have 60 people doing lots of fun things, and we think more people can develop more fields of architecture. Thank you.
Now for something quite different, which is the character of our panel. Very different. I'm going to talk a little bit about landscape architecture in the school and the foundations of the school and how I think this particular program has really influenced many important things in Ontario and in Canada. Many of the landscape architects who started the school, Michael Huff was the first director of the program. He's on my far right, your left. He was working with John Andrews, architect, who was the head of the program in 1963, and with Michael Hugo Brent, who was a planner of the day, and they worked on Scarborough College, and that's the fruit of their labor. And it was during that period that Michael was actually appointed as the head of the landscape architecture program in 1965, and he was part of that third wave of landscape architects that came to Canada, educated in the US, familiar with large-scale interdisciplinary planning, had mentors like Hideo Sasaki and Ian McHarg, and were graduates of Berkeley and Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania, and they were the first professionals that started teaching, and they started teaching people like me, who were the second wave. So I'm a graduate from 1980, and they were my mentors. And when I started my practice, in fact, it was a very interesting time because landscape architects were not only looking at traditional landscape architecture, but they were collaborating, because these folks were all collaborators, with scientists, limnologists, biologists, and we started looking at larger scale resource management. So when I worked, my first few years was really preparing things like design guidelines for forest management, looking at feasibility studies for looking at access roads into northern communities, and carrying capacity studies for lakes and First Nations properties. It was a systems way of thinking. It was that big picture, broad overview strategy. And that, I think, resonated very usefully into the future, because as you know, our profession has changed. I was for 2 years part of the Faculty of Forestry. Helps when you're dealing with the scientists, and that was the school was just part of forestry, and in the end came back to the School of Landscape Architecture and Architecture. Sorry, it's backwards, but I always saw it that way. Now, in the mid-90s, there was really the growth of an environmental consciousness. The systems-based thinking that we learned in the school, the design tools we learned in terms of design process, started to be applied to urban systems. And as many of you who knew Michael Huff, he was really a pioneer in this. He was a visionary, and he was both courageous and stubborn, and I think that's why he was successful. The Royal Commission on in the mid-90s, it was the Royal Commission on the Waterfront, led by David Crombie, that wondered what happened to the waterfront. We don't really have public accessibility. Worked very hard to address that. The other really important projects included bringing back the Dawn, greening the Portlands, and the brickworks. They were amazing projects, but they took that systems thinking, applied it to urban areas instead of just looking at remote and northern areas. And I think that, again, laid the foundations for the waterfront we have today. The game changer was climate change. For landscape architects, in my opinion, it's really changing our profession. We talked about green infrastructure in the 90s, and people didn't believe it, wanted nothing to do with it. Engineers and planners felt it was just green fluff, and today if you tell someone green infrastructure is not important to the city, I think they would significantly disagree. Well-known climatologists like Dr. Phillips basically stated they believe landscape architecture is one of the professions of the future because we take our design training, our tools, we apply them to the problems of the day, and today we are working on bolstering urban forests. We're looking at how to productively manage stormwater, and we're looking at how to improve the well-being of our communities, and these are just examples of reinventing stormwater management facilities and looking at streets differently. Now, I have 10 seconds left, so it's about the future, and this lovely image is courtesy of Arup. It's the Garden Bridge in London. It's a very spectacular vision, but I think what this tells us is that as our cities urbanize, we're going to look for healthy environments. We need clean water, we need clean air, and we need clean food. And as we urbanize, there'll be less and less space to do it. So now we're layering on green environments onto roofs, we're layering them onto walls, and we're putting them onto bridges because we're simply out of land. And I think these sorts of things are going to occur in the future. I'm working on an indoor park, and I'm working on a bridge not as elegant as this, but I'm working on 11 bridges that will look like this one day. And I do believe that the skills we learned in the school will, in fact, serve us well moving into the future, applying ourselves to different problems. And it's my pleasure to introduce Liat.
Thank you, Eha. I joined the faculty not too long ago in 2008, and I teach in the landscape architecture program. And I came in with an interest in the kind of systems thinking that Eha is talking about, in the ecological systems thinking of urban planning and urban design, but with also another interest in material technologies, in the micro aspect of designing these technologies and thinking about their implications on a large scale and regional scale. And in 2010, with colleagues, Professor Rob Wright and Dr. Ted Kesek, we started what's called the Green Roof Innovation Testing Laboratory, also known as the GRIT Lab, here on the rooftop of the Daniels faculty. And I'm proud to say that we're one of the only labs of its kind, not only in Canada, but in North America, and certainly the only one of its kind in any architectural school in North America. And what we were really interested in thinking about is looking at green building technologies, and while we believe that those are the right methods in moving forward with green infrastructure and thinking of outfitting our cities with more resilient technologies in context of climate change and climate change mitigation, it is important to also enter this kind of conversation with a critical view and ask ourselves, how green are green building technologies? And so to do that, we've constructed 3 research areas that are up on the roof. The first one looks at the construction of green roofs. And here we are looking at 3 performance criteria, namely around the potential for green roofs to affect thermal cooling and impact positively urban heat island effect, play a major role in stormwater management through reduction of runoff and delay in the peak volume of flow rates, and as well as increasing species habitat value on the roofs, such as pollinators, etc. The second research area is green walls, and this has an enormous potential here in a city where most of the building stock is an existing building stock. And so these do not really require any structural requirements, any sort of structural load capacity that can be adhered with a simple bracket onto walls. And here we're testing the potential for thermal cooling on building envelopes, and again the implication for energy conservation, as well as species habitat value and the aesthetic value of vertical landscapes. The third area, and this is a recent installation, and we are the first one in Canada to have this kind of installation. This is looking at the potential of combining and integrating green roofs with solar photovoltaic arrays. And the idea here is that solar photovoltaics work best in cooler and sunny temperature, or cooler temperatures and sunny weather. And when they're overheated with a conventional rooftop, their energy production decreases and their lifetime decreases. And so the new thinking is, what if we combine the two systems that are currently at odds with one another, the two industries competing with one another, and optimize energy production through the cooling effect of green roofs? We look at the motivations for our research is the recent legislation in Toronto, which is the first in North America to legislate a green roof bylaw, which mandates the construction on all new construction above 2,000 square meters. We're also motivated by this idea that there are products on the market. It is an industry product and a professional practice which is guided by standards and guidelines, and working with these two sectors to think about how to optimize the performance of green building technologies. And then the other idea from a pedagogical point of view is looking at our center as a hub, a multidisciplinary hub in the city of Toronto, in the University of Toronto, where we introduce the concept of one-to-one, hands-on, applied research and an interdisciplinary research with the civil engineering department, mechanical and electrical engineering, with biology and so on, and playing an active role in the conversation with our peripheral disciplines in understanding environmental performance. And the overall motivation is really this idea of having to think about these technologies in an increasingly changing climate environment with an aging infrastructure in our cities, particularly in the city of Toronto, and the loss of biodiversity. And so uniquely, our lab is very much interested in real-time data monitoring. We have currently over approximately 270 sensors that are recording every 5 minutes flow rates, temperature, surface temperature of all the different systems that we have, and we can then analyze the data and make the kind of assessments and report them back to our city partners and industry partners, and also think about how to cultivate a kind of next generation green building designer. Thank you.
So that was fantastic, and I think as you can see, there's a diversity into the group that we have here. And I think that one of the links or the streams that brings us together is this notion of design, the role of design, and it more than just about an object, it more than just about sort of like a thing that you're creating, but rather it's a process. And so with all of this, there's a huge amount of process design, but also stewardship at different scales. And this is something that Michael told me when I first started at the firm. that is borrowed from Mordialis, which is this idea of architecture is like filmmaking. It's not Howard Roark. It's something you do collaboratively in a huge way. And so my first sort of question to everyone is how does this sort of stream amount of collaboration you see in all of these sort of links has affected the way that you run your practice and research?
I have to admit, I don't know how to work without collaborating with others. My whole professional career, it's been either collaborating with natural scientists or collaborating with architects, now more and more with planners, urban designers. So that is just, for me, the norm. And I think the richness and the quality of the outcomes are what they are because there are many who contribute to problem solving. And as designers, we can actually conceptualize the ideas that others bring. It is our strength. It's what we bring to the table in terms of collaboration, is to use our design skills as the tool to help provide the solution when all the others provide the technical input. And that's, I've worked my whole career. I love it.
Well, for me, the Grit Lab is really a kind of continuation of a tradition in the school, particularly around the Center for Landscape Research, which for the past 20 years has really championed this kind of collaborative process, not only working interdisciplinarily, but also reaching out to industry and to city agencies and whatnot, and working on such large problems and thinking. With respect to the Grit Lab specifically, I think that it's not a surprise to me that this lab exists in the landscape program and in the architecture faculty within the University of Toronto. Most labs that are out there that are dedicated to green building technology research are located either in the biology department, and they're only looking at plants and the horticultural aspects of things. And if they're looking at water or energy, they're existing in the engineering buildings, and there isn't this kind of crossover. And I think that we, because of our kind of comprehensive and synthetical approach to things, by asking more complex questions and seeing the connections and the interdependency between systems, that we bring these kind of disciplines together under one roof.
I think what's also interesting is that as designers and people with design education, there is still that notion of visionary and idea and challenging and sort of working with others, whether they're bureaucrats, whether they're people from more specialty sort of uni-focused fields with different educational backgrounds. So there's this sort of way of how do you impact and influence a situation in order to create something bigger than the sum of its parts. And I think that's what we get from this sort of fantastic education that we all have. And I'd just be sort of curious about that. And I think it's sort of the role of being agents of change. And I think that all three of you in different ways are sort of agents of change. And Eha, when we chatted, there's this sort of idea that you touched on in your presentation of things that were sort of emergent in the 70s took 30, 40 years to become normal practice. And there's just a huge amount of tenacity, but it's also, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes to sort of make that happen. And I see that sort of in you doing it today as an emergent thing with collaborators, and Michael, the work that you do every day in working with stakeholders to sort of influence outcomes. And so sort of this idea of design thinking as a form of practice that might not be necessarily sort of permeating outside of design fields. And how does... So the question is...
Okay, I'll try that one. Janet Rosenberg and I organized a conference that happened last week, Cultural Landscape Foundation conference, and the purpose for which we did that, and it was about landscape. It wasn't about architecture. It was about landscape architecture. The purpose we did that was that group has a very strong interest in the quality of design public spaces. They're from the States. They'd never done anything in Canada. And we said, well, really what we're missing here, we've got some great waterfront parks, but our other parks are falling apart. We have real problems with what's going to be happening with the parks in the future. Even the waterfront Toronto parks are going to be handed over to the city parks who won't maintain them, all going to fall apart. So could we start to have a discussion about the quality of landscape architecture and design specifically to do with our public spaces. And especially since Toronto is a bit of a crisis with intensification, we still have the same amount of public spaces and they're getting overused to the point that they're really falling apart. So we just thought, well, let's organize it. Let's show some direction. Let's organize a conference. Let's get everybody here, have a discussion. We had about 500 people come to the conference. We had 1,200 people come to tours. We've got a website now. We can look at the history of different parks in the city. But I think it's essential that that with our education, we show leadership and we show direction and we show decision-making skills about emphasizing design as important. And it's a bit like general idea. You just do it. You don't mess around. You just go out and you do these things because I think our culture is receptive but not expecting. If you go out and you do these things, there'll be an interest, but there's no demand that you do it, and so you can be quite a lazy architect and not do anything.
One of the challenges we face as design professionals, in this room, everyone understands what design process brings to problem solving, conceptualization, working through options, optimizing a particular idea. It's not a linear process. When you work with others, and in my case with planners and other scientists, it's much more of a linear process to solve a problem. And so there is actually a misunderstanding about design, I think. The broader world, people think design is rendering. It's not. It's problem solving. And so part of what we need to continue to do is to educate our colleagues in these interdisciplinary teams that there is a real value to design. There's a value to actually designing the solution of the problem and solving the problem. And it's what we bring. And I think it makes for a much better outcome. And it is, I think, but there are a lot of other professionals who are frankly frustrated designers who would love to be able to draw and articulate their concepts and their solutions, but we have the ability to hold the pencil or the computer or the mouse or whatever it takes today and into the future to be able to think through a series of scenarios and integrate all of the information. It is really an important tool, and we need to continue to use it, and we need to educate others around how valuable it frankly is.
Yeah, I'd like to add to this idea of decision making. I think that one of our biggest roles at the Grit Lab is to allow professionals as well as decision makers and even industry manufacturers of these products that green building technologies are not a kind of one size fits all and cut and paste strategies, particularly when you're dealing with more living systems such as green roofs, et cetera, that have an inherent dynamics and are affected by climate and have a kind of ecological, a constructed ecological characteristic, and allowing people to have more of an in-depth knowledge on how to make the decisions around performance criteria is something that for us it's really missing from a conversation. So what we're seeing is that if you take green roofs, for instance, there is this overall assumption that, and it's in some parts true, that it aids in water management, it aids in thermal cooling, it provides habitat, biodiversity, et cetera, and all these things. But we don't really know the nuances and how it actually functions when you're changing certain variables. So what we're finding is that certain combinations perform really well with stormwater retention, but they're actually not as productive in terms of biodiversity. So there's an inherent conflict sometimes to the details and the construction details that we specify, and allowing for a more in-depth understanding in this kind of decision making. For us, that's really important. And so having access or having the ability to be in this particular facility
to have access to a professional audience, to decision makers, and to the industry, I think is a great strength of this faculty.
So you're describing a very science-based approach to research, which is, I think, pretty rare for a school of this type, which is remarkable. And I think that what I want to get next is the idea of research and research in practice. So you're as an academic able to engage in funded research that then affects practice through its outcomes. But Michael and Eha, you are practitioners, and so how do you engage in research? And I think that the standard narrative is that the school is a place for research and activism, and then there's sort of a crestfallen kind of like next stage of your career where you're doing video details for 10 years or something. And this has been mentioned a few times, but I've sort of had my personal narrative is I had this sort of wonderful experience of doing great interesting research with the faculty here, and that transitioning very smoothly into sort of a research-based approach to practice at ERA. And part of the question is, how does that work? How do you what is the value of, and how do you roll research into practice?
I would say we take, first of all, I had so much fun at school, I just want to continue it. So I thought that it was essential, and in terms of the idea about what I thought I wanted to be doing as an architect, I just thought I wanted to explore things that I was interested in. Hopefully I get paid for some of them. And so I've always thought that you would just do things and you would see how they work. Other firms do competitions, which is kind of an exploring certain things. And we just swore off any competition. We're just not doing any competitions. We do research on things we liked, and then if it turned out to be something we would have won the competition, we'd be the only competitors. It's interesting. If you're any other business, if you're making tires or widgets or something like that, it's assumed that part of your work is research and development. And so in a firm that makes tires, 4 to 7% of their revenue is spent on research and development. So we track the same kind of thing. We do about 5% or more in research, and they can be projects like tower renewal, but we also have people in Newfoundland or the Klondike studying smaller communities. We also have people looking at why Detroit's depressed and Toronto's not, and just things that we're enjoying doing, and it creates a kind of continuing education for people in the office. A lot of that, in fact, is how we've created our work. Most of our work comes out of having followed through on some interest from people in the office.
So research is very much part of many practices and businesses. In fact, I think all of the really successful ones do, in fact, apply research to their day-to-day work. And in my experience, particularly recently, it is the difference, I think, between a vanity project that you'd like to do just because you want to do it and working in a business where ultimately that research should develop stronger either relationships or develop knowledge that then can be applied to projects, is how it's managed and how it's selected. And it's my opinion that without research, you just become stagnant and stale. You have to evolve the work you're doing to move from what was being practiced in the 1960s to what people are looking at and how they're applying their knowledge and skill and design capabilities today. I mean, it's quite different, and there's a lot of knowledge and skill that has been identified over the past 50 years, and that is now found in the work. So it's something that occurs, whether it is organized and managed and focused, or whether it happens to be something that inspires you when you go that way. Mm-hmm. It's always available. It just depends on the culture of the firm you're working with, or the culture of the people you're working with, how, to the degree to which it's supported. In my view, the more research, the more successful the entity is, because that's the leading edge. That's the technical edge for professionals.
One of the things that I think ties this all together and is really interesting is this notion of ecology and the idea of an urban realm is a very complex space. So whether that's historical ecology, cultural ecology, to ecology, and looking at things from this sort of broad, four-dimensional systems approach. And I think it's really inspiring to see these sort of practice areas that you all bring to it, from what's on the roof to looking, going back to Eric Arthur and the history of Toronto. So one of the things that how do we then communicate that? And I know that it's brought into the school. I know that there's a huge part of that in terms of where the school is going now and this generation of students. I think what's exciting about what's presented here is that you could imagine yourself in a career that's very different than what's available now. Because I think that you're all doing things that you wouldn't think of as an architecture or landscape architecture career wrapped in a box. And so this is more of a rhetorical question, but how do we make sure that we equip people with the tools and inspire them so that they continue to expand practice and continue to push boundaries and to know that's a possibility. So it's very exciting that this is what we're seeing.
So I'll start with that one because, and I'll address ecology, because ecology is about science. You have to get the science right. So people do talk about understanding ecosystems and really don't understand how the hydrology works, how the biophysical systems work, and that is something, in my view, that is one of those core competencies that, moving into the future, people have to be taught, have to understand better. And it's like anything, if you're a structural engineer and you can't do the math on the stresses, it's not good enough. So in my view, to really understand ecological systems and what we need to do to improve resiliency into the future and what will actually work with regard to mitigation, we do need science, and we need to be able to test that science to see what works and what doesn't work. Because I think we live in a society where people say, show me. Show me how this is improving the quality of the air I breathe. Show me how this is improving the quality of the water I breathe. And we do need to have those kinds of the science and the research to actually provide that evidence. And that is something I think that in order to be able to stand behind what you say, you have to have the knowledge and the research to back it.
And I think I'll add to that too, the education that we get is a bit of communication and sort of showmanship. This sort of notion that you can do that, but then how do you synthesize it into being an agent of change? And I have to say, sort of the rude awakening of being thrown into practice, and suddenly realizing, for you to realize, what your interests are, you have to deal with politicians, bureaucrats, political cycles, the OMB, like all these things that require an amazing amount of navigation. And so, to all three of you, I'll sort of put this sort of question: how does professional expertise and this sort of notion of precision in science, how do you then work in that milieu, this very sort of like non-scientific, sort of troubling and challenging kind of reality?
I'll give it a try there because it's very interesting. I think science there's an extremely interesting number of ways that science plays a role in architecture, but architecture in the end is not a science, and cities are, it's like science can do certain things, but science can actually tell us really if it's going to rain this afternoon or not, for sure. And trying to analyze cities or understand cities, almost every metric you use doesn't get the whole picture. It just it kind of gives you a partial piece to what a city is. And so the expertise that architects and landscape architects bring is something that they can use science as a tool, but they're looking at bigger things that can't be captured by science. And it's kind of social behavior, it's the way way cities function, the kind of structures of cities, structures of the environment generally. They can't be captured, and so we really have to put forward, that's where the role of the expert, or that's the role of someone who's actually studied this a lot comes forward, to sort of say, I have a position, and I can argue my position, and I think it's the right position. But we always have to be aware that there's going to be alternate positions, which I go back to school where everyone was arguing completely different positions. They all had certain validity. You just have to make up your mind and make a commitment to the thing you think is the most valuable piece to push forward. And I think so it's discussions, it's dialogues, it's communication with other people, and it's a democratic process that really, I think architects can play a very valuable role in contributing to.
Well, to me, it's also a pedagogical question in terms of how are we training our students to actually interface with broader disciplines to talk about science. What I've found is that the actual hands-on, the one-to-one scale pilot project is an excellent forum to not only break down the silos, the disciplinary silos, and the difficulty in cross-teaching and all this kind of stuff, but to actually have an independent platform that allows for different people across the university to plug in, and then our students get to then interface and be trained by a biologist in the kind of, not only not in biology, but in a biological thinking, in the kind of methodology, and what questions do we need to ask? How do you set up an experimental design? What is an experimental design? How do you go about framing a question, and how should you develop your criteria? They're working with engineers in computer science, in scripting, which is not something that is unfamiliar to us in terms of three-dimensional design, but they're actually looking to program databases and real-time data acquisition, which is something that is everywhere around us. We're downloading apps and looking at real-time data streaming in every kind of realm of our life today. So having this kind of, I think, looking into the future in terms of the skill sets that our students are coming up with, to me is a kind of interesting realm to work in.
And I think at all levels, it's really pushing the boundary of that traditional frame of education, always about critical thinking, but these sort of new ways of engaging. So we've got a few minutes left, so I want to open it up to the audience if there's any takers. Any questions for the panel? Yeah, sir.
In 50 years, what do you think people are going to be looking back on and saying, I wish we had done this in 2015?
So many things.
I would say a stronger emphasis on climate change mitigation. That's exactly, if we make it to exactly. So, and I think that in that regard, a stronger agency, because we do play a big role. Buildings, for instance, account for, in Canada, 11.4% of GHG emissions. Transportation, 23.8% of emissions. So we have a huge role in urban design, the way we design our cities, the way we design transit, the way we design buildings, landscapes, play a huge role in it.
That brings up a point before we go to the next sort of audience question, is that this really all comes down to culture. And it's the idea that people aren't going to spend money and make decisions unless they believe in the idea. And I think that your story about changing culture over that 30 years, the work with Michael Huff and, Concrete Toronto, these other sort of position pieces that then expand culture. A little anecdote about that book is when we put it out, people were still really confused. It was only less than 10 years ago, and people were saying, like, I don't know, this is a little weird. And I started writing the pieces and reading them, and then we'd hear stories of like, oh, I went to Yorkdale Mall as a kid, I love that place. Mm-hmm. And now more and more of these buildings are actually designated heritage buildings. So, within a very short period of time, there's been sort of this shift. And one of the things that I think we all need to do in this sort of countdown to 2050 apocalypse is how do we, as agents of change, as educated design professionals, change culture? And it's not necessarily through doing this. Sometimes it has to be through making the case in a variety of ways. And it's sort of like that's the call to arms. It's showing it as an advocate, but advocacy is also about infiltration and making sure that you're part of. There's as many of you as part of the system as possible. Any other? Oh, sorry.
I'll venture a guess that we wished we would have torn the Gardner down long ago. And I worked for the outfit that did the EA. I think we would have wished that we would have demanded better quality in terms of design in our buildings, our physical environments. I think we would wish that we had paid much more attention to the character and quality of our stormwater management systems, because we will all, in 50 years, for those who are still around, I might not know I'm around if I'm still around in 50 years, would have wanted a healthier lifestyle, so more transit, better public realm, better spaces. I would want better food, cleaner air, and wished we had dealt with it now.
I'll go for...
Here comes the problem right now.
Yeah, thunderstorm.
It's a pathetic fallacy there.
I'd say the big issues right now are social equity and climate change, and at a global scale. And so we tend to think of ourselves in a very isolated position in Toronto, and like we're looking to, does our downtown pop park have a fancy granite finish? And things that in the larger order of consequences of things, it doesn't really matter. I think we have to look at these, and as architects, landscapers, I think we have to address these issues in a bigger way. How are we dealing? We can deal with social equity issues right now in terms of we're getting a very fancy downtown, but a very depressed suburban area. Climate change is a gigantic issue. I'm trying to figure out how in my job can I do something about that. So I think the thing in 50 years will say, why the fuck weren't we doing something about those things? Yeah.
Good question.
Eat that one, audience.
Yeah.
My question is given all the comments that you've been making about collaboration and cities, why isn't city planning part of the faculty and part of all these discussions?
You want me to answer that?
Yeah.
Front row.
Yeah.
Well, you might know that the faculty recently absorbed the program in the art program, and people did ask me and others that question when I arrived, why what was called geography, the program in planning was in the Department of Geography, wasn't with us because it had been historically. And there are practical and I think philosophical reasons. Some of the philosophical reasons are that in the history of planning, the planning disciplines, at least in North America, a lot of them have gone towards the social sciences and policy. And while those are very important areas of activity, there isn't a disciplinary kinship in the approach or in the thinking about even modes of agency between the way that architects and urban designers and landscape architects work and the kinds of planners that at least frankly exist at the University of Toronto think about affecting change. So on a philosophical level, I can speak personally, I didn't see a kind of platform for collaboration with that department as a whole, although there are single people that teach in our curriculum and that we share a lot of interest on issues like transit and people like Paul Hess and Andre Sorensen that are doing incredibly interesting work on the suburbs. So we do it in a tactical way. And I should say our current president is a planner and comes from on a practical level. He was the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science and is now the president. And I thought when I came in, it might not be a good idea to ask to have his department come to our faculty. There is an urban design faculty also. We do have an urban design faculty that has crossover and teaches across those two programs.
I'm George Baird, and I was just going to, it doesn't disagree with anything Richard just said, but a kind of amplification of a couple of points since I was in the school when planning left. And it was in the, it was a particular set of historical circumstances in play where the tension between the intellectual ambitions of the planners along the lines that Richard had just described were in particular conflict with the emerging crisis going on inside architecture. And that made it harder than it would normally be for the planners to maintain their kind of more traditional links with architecture. And so they did indeed decide to move. Well, the truth of the matter is they decided to leave without having the good sense to decide exactly where it was they wanted to go, which was not exactly wise, but that they were being impetuous. There's an interesting parallel in this narrative with what happened at the Graduate School of Design in Harvard several years previously, where the planners at Harvard made exactly the same decision for many of the same reasons, but they at least had the wisdom to figure out in advance where they wanted to be instead. And so they ended up at the Kennedy School of Government. Not a crazy place for the planners to be. But it's indicative that, what now, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, 10 years ago?
15.
Planning at Harvard has now returned from the Kennedy School to the Graduate School of Design.
And the policy people have now eaten up the designers, to be honest.
Well, just to say that there's a lot of logic, obviously, to the relationship of planning to social science.
Yeah.
But there might be an interesting model in our undergraduate program in architectural studies, which tries to develop a design focus without losing sight of its intellectual disciplinary home in arts and science. So my sense is increased reciprocity is not impossible.
So I have to say that for the audience member above, that was a phenomenal question. You got the current dean and the former dean to get involved, so fantastic.
I want to point out, Graeme, that actually your project for the tower renewal started when you were an undergraduate working with an historian.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I was actually going to sort of in wrapping, yeah, exactly, in wrapping this thing up, especially with this discussion of planning and architecture. I think an alignment is absolutely key, and I've had in my own education a wonderful alignment working with Paul and working with other people. But I think in the professional work that we all do, there's something really special that we get out of a design education, and it's completely unique than what you get out of a policy-driven education. And I'd say some of the accomplishments that we're probably all collectively proud of in our careers are led to policy decisions. You know, they lead to a sentence in a policy document that then allows for practice, but it comes out of the sort of activism, communication, design thinking, synthesis, and actually like vision that you get through this place. So kudos to 125. And thanks everyone.